It is the night of October 24th, 1943, somewhere in a frozen barracks on the Eastern Front. A young German signaller, exhausted after 18 hours on duty, fiddles with the dial of his radio set, hunting for a familiar frequency carrying dance music from home. Instead, he finds a German voice, clipped and authoritative, reading out casualty figures from a sector he recognizes, names he half remembers, complaints about incompetent officers that sound uncomfortably close to grumbles he has heard in his own mess hall. The voice claims to be a disillusioned Wehrmacht officer broadcasting from somewhere inside occupied Europe. It is not. It is a fabrication, assembled in the English countryside by a team of writers, actors, and intelligence officers, and beamed across the channel on the most powerful radio transmitter ever built up to that point. Within months, soldiers across the German military will be repeating rumors that originated not from any real dissenter in their ranks, but from a converted country house 40 miles from London. This is the story of how Britain built a machine to manufacture doubt, and used it to make an army doubt itself. It matters because warfare in the 20th century was not only fought with shells and steel, it was fought inside the human mind, in the gap between what a soldier was told and what he came to believe, and Britain proved, with startling effectiveness, that a sufficiently powerful transmitter and a sufficiently clever script could do as much damage to morale as a squadron of bombers, without a single life being risked in the attempt. By the early years of the Second World War, Britain faced a problem that conventional weapons could not solve. Nazi Germany controlled its population's access to information with ruthless efficiency. The Reich Ministry of Public Enlightenment and Propaganda, run by Joseph Goebbels, ensured that German civilians and soldiers alike received a carefully curated picture of the war, one in which setbacks were temporary, victory was inevitable, and any criticism of the regime was treason. Listening to foreign broadcasts was punishable in the most severe cases by death. The ordinary tools of persuasion, leaflets dropped from aircraft, official BBC broadcasts beamed into Europe, simply could not compete. German listeners knew the BBC was British. They knew its broadcasts were propaganda, however accurate, and a population primed by years of nationalist education discounted anything that arrived with a recognizably foreign accent or an obviously Allied source. The existing British propaganda effort, run initially through more conventional channels, achieved only modest penetration. Official broadcasts told the truth, largely, but truth delivered by an enemy voice is truth easily dismissed. What Britain needed was something far stranger. Propaganda that did not sound like propaganda at all, that wore the uniform of the enemy, spoke the enemy's own language with native fluency, and criticized the war not from a position of opposition to Germany, but, ostensibly, from a position of bitter, patriotic disappointment in how the war was being fought. The trick was not to tell Germans that Britain was right. The trick was to make Germans believe that other Germans, men just like them, were losing faith. There was a further complication. Britain's existing shortwave transmitters, scattered across the country and run by the BBC and various government departments, were individually weak and collectively unsubtle. German receivers of the period were typically built by deliberate state design, with limited tuning ranges that made foreign shortwave reception difficult for the average household set. A German civilian or soldier with an ordinary radio could not easily find BBC broadcasts, even if they wished to risk the legal consequences of listening. Medium wave, the band used for domestic broadcasting and therefore the band every German radio could receive without modification, was the only realistic channel through which deception could reach a mass audience. Yet medium wave transmission over the distances required, from Britain to occupied Europe and into Germany itself, demanded power on a scale no existing British transmitter possessed. Without that power, the entire scheme remained theoretical. There was also the matter of credibility under technical scrutiny. German listeners were not naive. Years of disciplined radio culture, reinforced by state warnings about enemy broadcasts, meant that anything sounding remotely foreign in production quality, Anything with the wrong static pattern, the wrong frequency stability, the wrong handover characteristics between regional relay stations would be dismissed within seconds. A broadcast had to be wrong in its content for the listener in exactly the way a frustrated, disillusioned German officer might be wrong, while being technically indistinguishable from genuine domestic transmission. This combination, cultural authenticity married to engineering fidelity, had simply never been attempted at this scale by any combatant nation. It required not one breakthrough, but several, occurring simultaneously in disciplines as different as broadcast engineering and dramatic scriptwriting. This required two things that on paper seemed almost impossible to combine. It required absolute fluency in German culture, slang, military jargon, and the texture of ordinary life, the sort of cultural fluency that could only come from native speakers utterly immersed in the world they were impersonating. And it required a transmission signal so powerful and so technically convincing that it could mimic, down to the static and frequency drift, an authentic broadcast originating from within the Reich itself. No existing British transmitter could manage the second requirement. The challenge was not merely to write convincing lies, but to build a machine capable of making those lies sound as though they came from inside Germany, even though they did not. The man who assembled the answer was Sefton Delmer, a British journalist who had grown up partly in Berlin, the son of an Australian academic, and who spoke German with the unaccented fluency of a native. Delmer was recruited into what became the political warfare executive, and he established his operation at Milton Bryan, a requisitioned country estate in Bedfordshire, alongside the earlier black propaganda unit based at Woburn Abbey. Delmer's genius lay in understanding that German soldiers and civilians would not believe a broadcast that praised the Allies or condemned Hitler outright. They would, however, believe a gruff, foul-mouthed naval officer who hated the British as much as anyone, but who hated the corruption, cowardice, and incompetence he perceived among certain Nazi officials even more. This character, broadcast under the name Der Chef, became the centerpiece of a station called Gustav Siegfried Eins, which launched in 1941 pretending to be an illegal resistance transmitter operating from somewhere inside Germany. The technical heart of the deception was a transmitter codenamed Aspidistra, after the famously indestructible houseplant that won't die no matter how badly it is treated, a nod to its resilience against jamming. Aspidistra was a 600-kilowatt medium-wave transmitter, originally built in America by RCA for a commercial broadcaster, then purchased by the British government and shipped across the Atlantic at considerable risk through U-boat-infested waters. Once installed at Crowborough in Sussex, inside a specially constructed bunker, it became, for a period, the most powerful radio transmitter in Europe, dwarfing anything Germany itself possessed. To put its power into perspective, an ordinary domestic radio transmitter of the period might run at a few kilowatts. Aspidistra ran at 200 times that strength, strong enough that its signal could, under the right atmospheric conditions, overpower German domestic stations entirely on their own frequencies, slipping British-produced content into the airwaves precisely where a German listener expected to find their own state broadcaster. This technique, known as frequency synchronization, allowed Delmer's broadcasts to fade in and out exactly as a German station might, mimicking transmitter handover patterns the Reich's own engineers used between regional stations. A listener twiddling the dial would believe they were simply picking up a different domestic relay, not a fabrication beamed from rural England. Engineers studying captured German broadcasting schedules worked out precisely when certain domestic stations went off air for technical reasons, then timed Aspidistra's intrusions onto those exact frequencies during those exact windows, so the transition felt seamless rather than sudden. The transmitter building at Crowborough was itself an exercise in concealment. Sunk partly below ground and camouflaged from the air, since a transmitter of such power and such obviously foreign purpose made an attractive target had the Luftwaffe identified it. The studio operation at Milton Bryan, meanwhile, ran on something closer to theatrical production than conventional journalism. Script writers worked in shifts to produce material fast enough to respond to real battlefield events within hours rather than days. Since a broadcast referencing yesterday's fighting felt current and credible, while one referencing events a week old felt stale and exposed the operation's distance from the front. The actors playing characters like Der Chef were chosen specifically for regional German accents and turns of phrase that matched the supposed origin of each program, since a Bavarian listener would instantly distrust a voice using Northern German idiom, and vice versa. Delmer reportedly insisted on extraordinarily coarse language and gritty content for some programs specifically because no official Allied broadcast would risk such material, reasoning that vulgarity itself functioned as a kind of authenticity marker no propaganda department would willingly stage. The content itself was produced by a small army of German exiles, prisoners of war who had agreed to cooperate, refugees and British intelligence officers who had spent years studying German newspapers, intercepted letters, and prisoner interrogation transcripts to ensure every slang term, every grumble about ration cards, every detail of barracks life rang true. Scripts referenced real units, real commanding officers, real local scandals gleaned from intercepted mail, lending an unnerving specificity that made the broadcasts feel like inside information rather than invention. Production numbers and precise staffing figures for Milton Bryan remain only partially documented. Like much of the political warfare executive's work, records were deliberately thin at the time, and many files were destroyed or remained classified for decades after the war, meaning historians have had to reconstruct much of the operation's scale from surviving fragments, veteran testimony given long after the fact, and the cross-referencing of German interrogation transcripts against known broadcast schedules. If you are finding this interesting, a quick subscribe helps more than you know. Operationally, the broadcasts targeted specific moments calculated to maximize psychological damage. Following the German surrender at Stalingrad in early 1943, output focused heavily on corruption and privilege among senior Nazi officials, contrasting the suffering of ordinary soldiers with the comfortable lives of those safely behind the front. Soldatensender Calais, a later and even more elaborate station purporting to broadcast for German troops from occupied Calais, mixed genuine, accurate war news, deliberately including unfavorable German losses that the Reich's own propaganda suppressed, with popular music and embedded rumor designed to corrode trust in command structures. Prisoner of war interrogations after capture repeatedly turned up soldiers who had listened to these stations and believed, at least in part, that they represented genuine internal German dissent. Captured letters and diaries referenced rumors that researchers later traced directly back to specific Milton Bryan broadcasts, suggesting the fabricated material had entered the genuine rumor mill of the German armed forces and continued circulating long after any individual broadcast had been forgotten as its origin. Exact figures for listenership remain elusive, since the German authorities had every incentive to suppress evidence that their own soldiers were tuning in, and post-war assessment relied heavily on captured personnel testimony rather than verifiable broadcast metrics. What is documented through Allied intelligence summaries and post-war interrogation records is that awareness of the stations was widespread enough that German authorities issued specific warnings against listening to them, an irony given that listening to any foreign broadcast was already a capital offense. The very act of naming and denouncing these specific stations risked confirming their existence and lending them an odd legitimacy. Within occupied territory, related British black propaganda stations targeted other audiences with similarly tailored deceptions, including programs aimed at French collaborationist sympathies and at Italian forces following Italy's exit from the war, though it is the German-facing operations centered on Aspidistra that remain the best documented and most thoroughly studied by historians. Specific named operations remain difficult to isolate in the surviving record, since the entire point of black propaganda was to leave no fingerprints. Unlike a bombing raid with a target list and a damage assessment, a successful broadcast left only rumors circulating in mess halls and letters home, evidence that survives, where it survives at all, by accident rather than by design. Researchers have nonetheless traced specific captured letters and prisoner statements directly back to identifiable broadcast content. The clearest proof available that the material did not simply vanish into the ether, but actively reshaped what ordinary German soldiers believed about their own command structure. Germany attempted similar efforts against Britain and its allies, most notably through broadcasts associated with the figure of William Joyce, the British fascist known to listeners as Lord Haw-Haw, whose programs mixed genuine news with mockery and unsettling personal detail about British towns. German black propaganda stations also existed, aimed at British and American forces, attempting comparable deception. Yet, they never achieved the same sophistication or technical reach. Germany's domestic propaganda apparatus, built around centralized state control and overt nationalist messaging, struggled to produce the same ambiguous, demotic, soldier-to-soldier voice that made Delmer's broadcasts so effective. German efforts tended towards the heavy-handed, easily identified as enemy material, whereas the British black stations were engineered specifically to avoid ever sounding like propaganda. Part of this gap was technical rather than purely creative. Germany never built, nor arguably needed to build, a single transmitter approaching Aspedistra's 600 kilowatts, since the strategic position of the two countries differed considerably. Britain needed to punch a signal across the Channel and deep into a hostile, heavily defended continent, while Germany's domestic propaganda needs were better served by its existing, more modest network reinforced by tight legal control over who could listen to what. The result was a curious asymmetry. The more open society, forced to compete for credibility against a totalitarian information monopoly, ended up building the more powerful and more technically audacious propaganda weapon, precisely because persuasion through obviously official channels could never have worked against an audience primed to distrust anything labeled as coming from the enemy. American efforts, meanwhile, focused more heavily on conventional white propaganda, openly attributed broadcasts through the Office of War Information, valuing credibility through transparency over the riskier ambiguity Delmer favored. The American approach generally avoided the ethical murkiness of impersonating enemy dissidents, regarding the technique as too close to disinformation for an open democracy to employ comfortably, even in wartime, which left the black propaganda field largely to the British. Where American and British psychological warfare efforts did combine, particularly in the run-up to and aftermath of the Normandy landings, American planners frequently deferred to the political warfare executives' accumulated expertise in the black propaganda discipline specifically, recognizing that Delmer's organization had developed a craft that no other Allied power had matched, let alone exceeded, by 1944. Assessing the true impact of this campaign remains genuinely difficult, and honest historians acknowledge as much. Morale is notoriously hard to measure, harder still to attribute to a single cause amid the cumulative pressures of years of total war, military defeat, and aerial bombardment. What can be said with confidence is that the broadcasts reached a substantial audience, that documented rumors within German forces can be traced to specific transmissions, and that German authorities took the threat seriously enough to invest resources in jamming, counter-propaganda, and explicit warnings to personnel. The psychological effect likely mattered less as a single decisive blow than as one corrosive element among many, contributing incrementally to a broader erosion of confidence that accelerated as German military fortunes declined from 1943 onwards. The technique influenced later Cold War psychological operations directly, with both British and American intelligence services adopting variants of black propaganda broadcasting against the Eastern Bloc throughout the following decades, and elements of the approach can be traced in information operations conducted by Western agencies well into the latter 20th century. Operators who had cut their teeth at Milton Bryan went on to advise on broadcasting strategy aimed at audiences behind the Iron Curtain, carrying forward the central insight that an authentic-sounding voice could achieve what an openly hostile one never could. The Aspidistra transmitter itself survived the war and continued in British government service for decades afterwards, eventually used for BBC World Service transmissions, a peculiar afterlife for a machine built specifically to deceive, its enormous broadcasting capacity repurposed for entirely legitimate journalism once the war that justified its existence had ended. Surviving documentation, recordings, and equipment related to the operation can today be found in the Imperial War Museum's Sound Archive and in the National Archives at Kew, where declassified files continue to surface, slowly filling in gaps that decades of official secrecy left behind. Return for a moment to that signaller in his frozen barracks, dial in hand, certain he has stumbled upon a genuine voice of dissent within his own army. He has not. He has found the product of a country house in Bedfordshire, a transmitter bunker in Sussex, and a team of writers who understood that the most dangerous weapon against a totalitarian state is not a bigger bomb, but a single, well-placed doubt. Britain did not need to convince German soldiers that the Allies were right. It needed only to convince them that they could no longer be certain who, within their own ranks, was telling the truth. What Aspidistra and Milton Bryan achieved was not victory through firepower, but victory through uncertainty, manufactured at scale and broadcast with a fidelity that blurred the line between fabrication and authenticity until German listeners could no longer reliably tell the difference. No bombs fell because of Der Chef's tirades. No bridges collapsed because of Soldatensender Calais. But trust eroded, quietly, broadcast by broadcast, rumor by rumor, in barracks and signal rooms across a continent at war. The voices were never real. The doubt they planted was, and in a war ultimately decided as much by will as by weaponry. That doubt was its own kind of devastating weapon, one built not from steel and explosive, but from 600 kilowatts of borrowed American engineering, a handful of brilliant impersonators, and the simple, terrible idea that an army which no longer trusts its own voice has already begun to lose.